Good evening. Thank you. Oh, that's all I get? Good evening. Welcome. Sorry. My name is Yaniv Segal, and I'm the acting assistant conductor of the Detroit Symphony. And it's a pleasure to chat with you today about this fantastic program that the orchestra will be playing in just a little while. Returning to the podium is Fabien Gabel, who is from Paris. He's the music director in Quebec, and he's been here several times. It's really great to have him back. And very exciting today is that the soloist, Hunter Eberle, is the principal trumpet of the Detroit Symphony. So he's the featured soloist for the night. So he gets to stand up here instead of all the way in the back for a change. As it is a trumpet concerto, you don't have to worry, you'll hear him the whole time, I promise you. So on the concert tonight are 4 pieces, and I like concerts with 4 pieces. I don't know why. You know, often you think there's like an introductory piece and then a concerto, and on the second half you have some kind of main symphonic work, a longer work. In this case, there are 2 works by Igor Stravinsky, which I'll come to in just a bit. We open the program with a tone poem by Tchaikovsky called The Tempest, which is, of course, based on Shakespeare's play. And Tchaikovsky had an affinity for Shakespeare. Of course, we know of his famous Romeo and Juliet fantasy overture. He also wrote another tone poem called Hamlet. Now, what's really interesting about this tone poem, as opposed to perhaps the more well-known Romeo and Juliet, this one is actually written several years later. But if Tchaikovsky, when he named Romeo and Juliet, when he named the piece, it's called a fantasy overture. And it has the ideas of the play and the characters and affects, but it doesn't tell a story in specific scenes. You can't really point to a specific part of the music and say, this is when this happens, this is when this happens. He just used the idea of Romeo and Juliet and turned it into music. Well, in The Tempest, he actually included a program, like a words program, describing what happens musically. You know, other people who have done things like this would have been Strauss or Liszt. There was a whole movement for descriptive programmatic music. And so Tchaikovsky is experimenting with that. So it starts out with the C, and there's rolling chords up and down, and you hear kind of, you're lulled into the feeling of this massive C. And of course, in the play, there's a big storm, and then there's a big storm in the music. And this storm is incredible. I had the pleasure, of course, of sitting here during the rehearsals, and you know, I know the music, and yet I still get shivers and chills because it's such an incredibly powerful and visual, you know, oral visual representation of a storm. So it's really great, powerful music. Then there's the different characters come into play. There's a love theme that starts out at first uncertain, but then comes back in full passion. At the end, the magician is banished from the island, and again, we end with the sea. So, in listening to it, I wonder if the program is actually in the books, because I haven't had a chance to see it. But, you know, glance at it if you can before you hear the music, and I think you'll recognize quite clearly when each section happens. Because again, as opposed to something like Romeo and Juliet, here it's very sectional. It's very clearly delineating the characters and the story. Of course, Tchaikovsky has a brilliant gift for melody and harmony and color, and the orchestra just sounds fabulous. The love theme is reminiscent, I would say, of the famous Romeo and Juliet. But that's just his style. One of the nice things about a program like this is you get to hear very many different colors from the orchestra. So in the first piece, we have Tchaikovsky's lush Russian melodic treatment. And then next is something very, very different. The Trumpet Concerto is by a French composer, Henri Tomasi. And let's see, I think he was born in 1901 or so to 1971, I think were his years. So he was born in the south of France to Corsican parents, and his father was an amateur musician, but very early on saw musical talent in his son and pushed him towards music lessons and later piano. And in several places you can read that Tomasi was paraded around as a young kid, kind of like maybe Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had been. You know, he had to play for all the kings, so Tomasi had to play for all the wealthy patrons in the neighborhood, and he hated it. He felt like he was, you know, being used as a trained monkey. An infinite number of monkeys could probably play an infinite number of Mozart concertos, but so he started out really young, and then his training as a composer was halted by World War I. He was kind of in this lucky age where he was too young to go off to war, so he didn't have to serve, but during the wartime he ended up making a living by playing piano in cafes. And probably, you know, when you're a creative individual and you have all those hours at the keyboard, he probably made up half the stuff he played and used it for material later. And then he did end up getting a formal training, has, you know, won some big prizes, and actually made a name for himself also as a conductor. He conducted, he was interested in film, so he conducted scores, he conducted radio orchestras as well as live orchestras. And as a composer, he has about 120 works, I think. The Trumpet Concerto is the most well-known and the most popular, but he also has a violin concerto, a saxophone concerto, a clarinet. Probably every instrument in the orchestra has a concerto by Tomasi, as well as several operas. And he, okay, if you think about, you know, when he's young and what is he hearing and what is music going through, the early 1900s were a period of upheaval in classical music. You start out with the stretching of tonality. Post Tchaikovsky, who was so romantic, you have Wagner, you have Strauss, especially in his later years, really, you know, pushing what you could do with this system. Then you have the Second Viennese School, the Schoenbergs, the Weberns out there who are saying, well, maybe there are other tonal systems that we can use. And Tomasi chose to make music that sounded good. So he is not constrained by a system. He's not writing for anybody, but he, at heart, he loved melody. And so he writes music that is extremely well crafted, fun to listen to, beautiful, and you know, not in any way, what should I say, offensive. You know, it's fun. If you listen to some of his works through different periods, he definitely experimented with sound. But in this concerto, written in 1949, it's absolutely, you know, uses the instruments like normal. I don't know if anybody was here for the most recent classical masterworks when we started with a work by an American, you know, middle-century composer who used every instrument in the orchestra in ways that have never been used. You don't have to worry about that tonight. It's in 3 movements, like a traditional concerto, fast, slow, fast. The trumpet is asked to play a variety of different mutes. So you'll see Hunter will have a music stand here with various different shaped objects that he has to put into the bell of the mute. The bell of the trumpet. And they all create these gorgeous different colors. So if you know, have heard a jazz trumpet or an orchestral muted trumpet or, you know, a wah 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 kind of sound or a felt mute, each one of these types of mutes creates a different sound, and very well written for the instrument. You can hear all these great colors, especially in the beautiful second movement. There are a lot of challenging parts in this piece for the trumpet player. In fact, in the score, there are a number of passages which the composer has actually written optional for the trumpet, and then those parts are covered in the orchestra. Hunter plays them all. He's phenomenal. He can absolutely play them all and sound great on everything. But it is not in any ways an easy piece. So it's a real treat. And actually, Fabien Gabel, the conductor, before he became a conductor, was a trumpet player. And he played, I don't want to get it wrong, he played in the Paris Opera, I believe, and his father before him as well. So he knows the piece very well, and it's a great collaboration. So then on the second half, we have two different works by Igor Stravinsky. Again, a master of color, orchestration, melodic ideas, rhythmic ideas. And what I really love, absolutely love about Stravinsky is that no matter what material, no matter what he's going for, you can always listen to his music and know it's Stravinsky. And I'll say why that's so important in these pieces. So the first piece is called Shantou, or the Song of the Nightingale. And it was intended as an opera, or an operatic kind of work. And in 1909, 1910, Stravinsky wrote the first act of this opera. And then if you know the important history that was going on in Paris with Stravinsky, he was hired by Diaghilev, Serge Diaghilev, to write some ballets for the Ballet Russe. And then he wrote the Firebird, incredible music. And then he wrote Petrushka, which was, astounding. And then, of course, the Rite of Spring. Within 3 or 4 years, he wrote these 3 ballets, orchestral scores, which basically changed the face of classical music and music in general. It's just, the Rite of Spring especially has influenced everything that comes after it. And then he went back to finish the Chant du Rossignol. Well, just imagine, the creative growth that he experienced in these 3 or 4 years. And Acts 2 and 3 of the opera sound like a completely different opera from Act 1. Act 1 is romantic. Act 2 and 3 are crazy. And great. And he uses some of the same melodies, but he just didn't know what to do. He had to finish it, and he just couldn't go back to that old style. He is a changed person. So, what you hear tonight are extracts, is like a suite, if you will, taken from the second and third acts with no singers. Everything is orchestrated into the orchestra. And the first act basically doesn't get performed unless you do the whole opera, which it very rarely gets performed. But in this version, he follows the story of his opera, and it has been set as a ballet as well. It's very descriptive. There's absolutely a story that goes along with it. It's the Hans Christian Andersen tale about an emperor who hears a nightingale and it's a beautiful sound, and then he hears a mechanical nightingale and decides that that's even better than the real thing. And then the real nightingale flies away, very sad. And then the emperor's falling ill and dying, and the real nightingale comes back to sing to him again, and he realizes how beautiful her voice was. And the song is so beautiful that even death is charmed, and the emperor miraculously gets better. It's a little harder to follow that in the music than the Tchaikovsky, which is quite obvious. But you can rest assured there is a story. And in this case, the emperor is perhaps Chinese or somewhere in the East, and so Stravinsky makes a great use of the pentatonic scale, very traditionally associated with Asian music. and many other elements that are his signature of using two types of keys or tonalities at once, of using very complicated rhythms, of creating an ostinato, a repeated figure that serves as background for some kind of foreground melodic material. And you can, see him trying to craft this material he had already written in his new vernacular. It's a great piece. It's not performed as often as the other ballets, but it is one of my favorite works, and as well as the conductor's. So I think you should enjoy it, especially if you've never heard it before. Has anybody heard the Shantou Rossignol before? All right, wow. Okay, so it's a premiere. 107 years ago. And then to follow that up is perhaps one of the more well-known suites, which is this 1919 suite from the Firebird, which was the first of these three ballets that he wrote for the Ballet Russe. Now, the Firebird, I guess it has another bird in it. The story is again about a magical bird and saving the life of a prince, and it's all fine and good. But what happened is, in 1910, 1911, and I think he wrote it in 1910, the orchestra he used was very big. And Stravinsky created an orchestral suite taken from the ballet in 1911, using basically that entire large orchestra. And in 1919, he decided to change the movements in the suite and also to reduce the forces. So it's for a completely full-size orchestra, but in instrumental terms, instead of having 4 or 5 flutes, you only have 3. Instead of having 5 oboes, you only have 2. That kind of stuff. So he redistributed the material and reworked it. You won't notice anything missing, but it's just a kind of a more practical way of playing this, of treating the music. And sometimes people do perform the entire Firebird these days without cutting it into a suite. And of course, the music is beautiful and it should be heard. But I like the suite because it's the sections that the composer was the most happy with, and he selected them in an order, and he connects them, and it really works in this format without you feeling like there should be dancing going on. If you can dance if you want. You just tell your neighbors before you start moving around. But anyway, it's really a great work. Of those 3 ballets, it is the most romantic of them. There are a few elements that are shared, I think, more with that first act of the Rossignol, which we don't hear tonight, but there are some similar elements. And recently, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there was an early work by Stravinsky that was discovered. His primary teacher was Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was, in his own right, a great composer and also an amazing orchestrator, and kind of taught this new school of orchestration, which is how some people like Stravinsky treats the orchestra so incredibly well. And when Rimsky-Korsakov died, there was a concert in his honor, and Stravinsky wrote a piece of music for his departed teacher. It was called Funeral Song. It was his first orchestra work, I believe. And then after the performance, the parts disappeared into a library for 100 years. And even people asked him about it, and he said, yeah, I wrote this piece when I was younger, and I don't even remember how it goes. I think there was a procession in it and whatnot, but I can't rewrite it because I don't remember it. Well, now we have it, actually, and it's been performed and it's been recorded. And what's really interesting is to see that work, and then the Rossignol, and then Firebird, and see how in his young years he used and was trying to discover his own voice and his gift for creative development of materials. Stravinsky, as you can imagine from his type of music, was a very methodical worker, a craftsman, I shouldn't say worker. He would go into his studio in the morning and would sit down to compose, either at the desk, at the piano, whatever. Sometimes he came out with 1 bar of music, sometimes with 3 minutes of music, sometimes with no music. But he worked, you know, every day at it. And you can just see that every single note, every single dynamic in his music is crafted well and makes perfect sense. And you can also think that with these complicated rhythms, in a time before computers, before electronic music, to come up with these types of cross rhythms and cross harmonies required a lot of work, of crafting the notes so that they would fit, and also just an incredible inner ear to know what the final version would sound like. So I think that Stravinsky is amazing. Like I said, he even from a young age knew how to write from the orchestra with very effective music, very individual music. He wrote in many styles in his life. In the 20s, he started to embrace neoclassicism, which means in music, he took elements from Baroque music, classical music, and reshaped it in his own particular idiom. Like his opera, The Rake's Progress, is like that, the Violin Concerto, some of his symphonies. And then he was resistant towards the whole movement towards 12-tone music and serialism. And he and Schoenberg, I think, lived in LA for many years and just didn't talk to each other or avoided each other at all costs. But actually, towards the end of his life, he did start to incorporate some of that in his music. His last work, which I just listened to a few days ago, is called Requiem Canticles. And it's a very small requiem and pointillistic and using serial techniques. And just even in this, you know, he was probably 75 years old at the time, and or maybe even 80. He was still incredibly creative, and you can hear his own voice. So 3 very different composers, 4 different pieces of color, of melody, of ideas. All of them, well, the 3 works aside from the concerto, all are some kind of descriptive music telling a story through music, which you can follow along or not. It's still great music. So I really love this program, and the orchestra sounds great. So I have a few minutes left. If there are questions about the program, about the orchestra, please shoot, go ahead, and I'll do my best to answer. I should always start out by saying, at the end, I will ask questions. Yes? Oh, hi. Welcome. My name is Yaniv Segal. I'm the acting assistant conductor this year. So thank you. It's nice to be here. I live in Ann Arbor. I went to University of Michigan. Anybody else? Go Blue. I hear there's a football game this weekend that we're supposed to root for one. I'm supposed to send my kids to daycare with either blue or green or yellow or I don't know. I'll send them in red. It'll be great. Yes. When you say he, do you mean Hunter or the composer? Hunter, yeah. So I saw him before the first rehearsal, and he had like 12 or 14 mutes on the piano, and he was trying each one out. So, you know, each mute has a different resistance. So when you're playing a brass instrument, you're buzzing your lips on a small mouthpiece, and having to hit these tiny, 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 they're called partials, you know, in a physics wave. If you think about a wave and then the compressions and whatnot, like as the wave gets tighter and you get higher and higher, those spots get smaller and smaller that you have to nail. So every single mute has a slightly different back pressure. It blocks the amount of air that goes through. So some are easier to play than others. Based on the material of the mute, as well as how much it blocks or lets through, the color of the sound changes. So you have to think, what is the affect that you're going for here? Sometimes composers specify cup mute or plunger mute or just mute, leave it up to the performer. And each person will be very individual, as well as this particular instrument he plays or the mouthpiece or whatnot. Now there's a lot of high writing that is asked to be muted, and that means it's very risky, because those high notes are the harder ones to hit in the first place, and now you're creating more pressure inside the instrument, which kind of even makes it even narrower, those little spots that he's got to find. So actually, Fabien brought his old mute from Paris that he used to play this concerto with. He says he hasn't really played very much, and he doesn't expect to play the trumpet too much anymore. And so he gifted it to Hunter for him, and Hunter is using that mute on this concert, and it is exactly that. It was easy to play and sounded great, and exactly in those registers where it was necessary. Was there another hand? I'm sorry. Well, then in that case, I will say, enjoy the concert, 4 great pieces, your fantastic Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Thank you for coming.